very miniature biography of each for about 5 minutes. Then unmute yourselves, and I'd like to hear your questions, or in some cases, you may know something connected to the history of these women. You'll be surprised when you hear who they are. So we're going to do 4 of those. It'll be 5 minutes of me, 5 minutes everybody, okay? All right, now welcome any questions or concerns. So shall we just begin then? Okay, so thank you for the invitation to do this. I think I want to say 2 things by way of an introduction. One is when we talk about who are Franciscan women, most people will automatically think, and this will be true of what I share tonight, of the sisters. But it's important to remember that the Franciscan family is made up of, when you speak of the women, they come in 4 shapes and sizes. 1, the Poor Clares, who are the women who are enclosed in a cloister. And Jean-Francois is a big expert on that topic, and I have some knowledge, so we might talk about them later. 2nd, Franciscan women who enter religious communities that are active: nurses, teachers, social workers, missionaries. 3, women who become part of the secular Franciscan order, which is an order recognized in the church for lay people to follow a Franciscan way of life. And 4, women who are inspired to lead a Franciscan way of living without necessarily being in an institutional form, but it's a personal gift, a personal spirit, a personal pathway. So I just want to mention that there are lots and lots and lots of Franciscan women. And when you look at all of those categories. Second thing I want to mention is that a couple of the women I'm going to talk about come from the 19th century. And just by way of introduction, I want to just make a couple of points about what life was like for women at that time, because it was very different from the 20th and certainly from the present time. So when we talk about women who founded religious communities, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them in this country, in the 19th century, first of all, it was a time of great anti-Catholicism. So just as today we have Islamophobia, in the 19th century in America, it was Catholicism phobia. Catholics were discriminated against, hated, mistrusted. And when these women attempted to do what they were doing, they weren't being welcomed with open arms, like, oh, the good sisters. So I think that context helps us understand something about the kind of character they had in order to succeed. The other thing is, this country was mission territory. So the rules and regulations about how one would found a school or a community or even a diocese was very, very different. And many of the dioceses were so new that they were only getting their very first bishop. So it's not like a long-standing institution such as we would see today. 3, the way of being in religious life, of being a sister, a nun, in the middle of the 19th century was, to use the word that's so popular these days, fluid. People would start in one community and things wouldn't go so well, so they would leave and go somewhere else. We have women that founded a community and then left and founded another, so that you might have in the history several congregations of sisters who all stem from one woman's inventiveness, or just, you know, she wasn't a person to stay put. She just kept moving. She had she lived in nomad land before Frances McDormand was in nomad land. You know, they just kept moving west or moving to new territories. And I also want to say that because of those conditions, many of the women that we know about today from that period of time were exceptionally strong intellectually, emotionally, and I would go so far as to say they were headstrong. They did not hesitate to butt heads with a bishop or a pastor or with one another. And so you also had communities that would start off and then break apart because the women who wanted to be leaders weren't able to do all of that and stay together in one place. So it was a very, very different time. And I think just those few hallmarks might be helpful. So usually because we think of women in history as something very far away, my first two women actually have a big connection to Allegheny, New York. So the first is the woman who didn't found, but who was considered the founder of our own Allegheny Sisters. So here's her story in brief. In 1855, a corporation was established in what was then called Allegheny City. Today it's the village and the town. And the name of the corporation was the Missionary, Scientific, Charitable, and Benevolent Society of St. Francis of Allegheny City. And the people who founded the corporation were the family of Nicholas Devereux and Bishop Timon. And they founded the corporation because a year later, the first friars were going to arrive in the country, and Nicholas Devereux, being a very brilliant businessman, knew that he had to create a legal entity for these immigrants to be able to come and work in the United States. So they arrived in 1956, and immediately they began to build the building for St. Bonaventure University, and they founded the parish of St. Nicholas, today it's Little Bonas, St. Mary's in Olean, and St. Pacificus over in Humphrey on Chapel Hill. But as people began to come to the friars and the boys started to sign up to go to St. Bonaventure, the women were like, wait a minute, we have young ladies to be educated, we have girls to be educated. So the founder of St. Bonaventure, whose name was Pamphilo Pietro Battista, he came from Abruzzi in Italy. He was extraordinarily progressive in his outlook. He was told by a colleague, he said, you ought to go and find sisters and bring those sisters here to Allegheny to help you. He had a very different idea. He wanted to create a group of sisters who would be native people living right here in Western New York. His first chance came when 3 women, 2 lay women and a sister, came from Philadelphia because they had heard about him. He really established a big reputation very early for being willing to help women who wanted to be Franciscans. So these 3 came, and in a short time, he had received them to start a new congregation. But later that year, he was on his way to New York City to meet friars who were still arriving from Italy. And he went to Fort Lee, New Jersey, and he was an overnight guest in a rectory there. And for breakfast, the next morning after his arrival, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Ann O'Neill showed up with warm bread that her mother made for the pastor and his guest. And the pastor said to Pamphilo, that's Mary Ann, and she's a lovely young lady, and I really think she has a vocation to be a sister. Pamphilo didn't miss a beat. He told her that there was a new sisterhood being created at St. Bonaventure, and would she like to come and join him? Now, she was 15, and she said she didn't think that her parents would be favorable to that idea. But a year later, she came. And he received her into the community. So she's 16 years old now. 4 years later, she had finally made her vows, and she was not only teaching in the New Girls Academy, She made her vows, and the community was allowed to have its first election, and they elected her as the leader. She was 20. This is the piece about her that just blows my mind. That she clearly had, the kind of intellect and emotional maturity way beyond her years that he recognized and the other women recognized, even though they had come first. So they didn't say, well, we were the ones who got here and got everything started. So she began as a new superior of the congregation. And I'm just going to say very briefly, she taught actually at St. Elizabeth's Academy for 40 years. She served as a director and teacher. But during her time, the congregation created 25 foundations in New York, New England, and Jamaica. And what happened was there was a bishop in Jamaica who had a small community of sisters. They were founded by sisters from Scotland. But when the Scottish sisters went back home, and John Francois and Athena probably know, they were probably too homesick for the Highlands to stay in Jamaica. So they went back to Scotland, and the native Jamaican sisters were having a really rough time without their help and their leadership. So this young community in Allegheny, New York, adopted this Jamaican community and brought it in to become part and parcel. So from that very early time, the community was very multicultural, which is another factor, I think, to really pay attention to for our sisters. They founded hospitals, they founded nursing homes, and after Pamphilo left, because he was he was really the guide and the protector and the person they could go to with difficulties, things did not fare so well with the other friars. The other friars were more paternalistic, I think, in their attitude. And so Mary Ann, whose name was Sister Teresa, she fought to get the community out of the control of the friars and directly under Rome, which sounds like that would be worse, but really it wasn't. To be under the control of Rome for sisters back in those days was actually freeing, because it meant a local bishop and a local pastor could not mess with you. If they did, Rome would intervene and protect the rights of the sisters. So she saw to all of that. And as we know, in modern times, our sisters here in Allegheny not only have gone throughout the Eastern Seaboard, establishing huge healthcare systems down in Florida, in New Jersey, here in Olean, but also in Brazil. And now, I don't know if you know this, they are undertaking a mission in Mozambique, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, a very dangerous place. But the advantage our sisters have is that Mozambique was a Portuguese colony, and their Brazilian sisters will be able to go and not have a language issue to get that mission started. And our sisters have also been in the forefront here of peace and justice work, the back to the land work with their direction of Canticle Farm, and ever so many benefits that they've brought to us. So I'm going to stop there and see if anybody would like to unmute and share any of your reflections about our Allegheny sisters and the gifts they have brought to our area. Not sure how well you know them, but.
Well, I remember Sister Pavarello.
Yes.
Who was really a strong woman, much part of our healthcare advocacy work.
Oh, okay.
And she was really good. She was very, very good.
Yeah.
That's probably the one I know the best. And Sister Joyce with Canticle Farm,
right,
was very strong with Canticle Farm and that work.
Right. And I know, for example, that Sister Grace, who is a sister down in there, Jamaica, mission is considered the Mother Teresa of Kingston, Jamaica. She has worked among the poor people there for years and years. And they say that they're in a very dangerous neighborhood, but as long as you're with Sister Grace, you will be safe, going down there. So,
And a few of the sisters are with the village. I mean, they're at least
Yes.
contacts, and it'll be really exciting to see how we could work together, partner
Right.
together.
Right.
So it's
Yeah,
been
I
very
think there's a lot
positive.
that can be done.
And the fact that they stood at the downtown every Thursday for peace was admirable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very gutsy. Yeah.
I may add a little something.
Sure.
Because in 1989, thanks to you, Margaret, I was, how would I say, hired by the Franciscan Sisters of Allegheny for a few Franciscan teaching. And that included a week in Jamaica.
Right.
That I actually, I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed what they were involved with. There was teaching. They were also poor people. They were people with leprosy. And I had the blessing, the good fortune to have one of their sister, Jamaican, taking care of me and understanding that I was really interested with the Jamaican people and what the sisters were doing. So she actually drove me throughout the island with a few stops so that I would get a real flavor. It has been an important experience in my life.
Yeah.
What they're doing there. The previous one that I had was also in the south. It was in Brazil a few years before. But the experience with the sisters in Jamaica was something that remains a very important and happy memory, even though, but that was probably because of my ignorance, I got sick 6 months later, and it was with hepatitis B that I may have connected over there in making sure that I don't drink the water, but I never paid attention rinsing my mouth after brushing my teeth. Well, I learned.
Right. So you brought home a souvenir you didn't want.
Yes.
From Jamaica.
Yes. The bad part of it is that I can never give my blood.
There, yeah, I know. Yeah. And I know the sisters were thrilled to have you back at that time too.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to number 2. This is another woman with a brief contact here in Allegheny, but I think it's important that we claim her. This woman's name in childhood was Maria Catherine Moes, M-O-E-S. She was born in Luxembourg. And as a young woman, she came to America, and a sister of hers came with her or followed her shortly thereafter. And by the early 1950s, she had joined a sisterhood, the School Sisters of Notre Dame in Milwaukee. But she did not stay with that sisterhood very long. She apparently, they had some sort of frontier assignments that were horrendous. And she was sent into one of those situations, and really, it was extremely difficult for her. But she did make her final vows, which is, your final incorporation into the community. And she kept on working, but she was already getting branded as a troublemaker. That she was, as I say, one of those headstrong people that just kept trying to find the right situation and do the right thing. She finally realized that she was not going to be happy and she was not going to be really accepted in this group. And she also had learned about this famous Father Pamphilo here at St. Bonaventure. So in the early 1960s, she wrote to him and asked, would he, with his authority, receive her as a Franciscan sister? And he agreed to do that. Just a year or two later, she came here to Allegheny with one other young woman who wanted to join her, and he officially brought them into a Franciscan sisterhood and gave them official approval. Now, fast forward. She creates her community in Joliet, Illinois, but I'm not going to spend any time on Joliet because that's not very exciting. Eventually, she went to Rochester in Minnesota to begin a school there. And early in her time in Rochester, there was a big conflict between herself and the sisters back in Joliet, and they separated, forming two independent groups. The next big event in Rochester is that a tornado tore through the town of Rochester. We're in 1883 now, so we're almost 20 years later. And there was general devastation, a lot of people wounded, a lot of building structures quasi-destroyed. And the sisters immediately turned their convent into a makeshift hospital, and sisters were sent out to the various places where the wounded were being brought to be cared for by doctors. The doctors caring for those wounded people were Dr. William Morrell Mayo and his son, the Mayo doctors. So Mother Alfred immediately began to see that these two doctors were very competent, and what would happen if something like this ever happened again? There was no place for the people. So she went to Dr. Mayo and said, I've had a waking dream that we should start a hospital here, and you would be the director of medical services and my sisters would work with you. And he just looked at her and said, I'm not a Catholic. That didn't even faze her. So this woman is only like 100 years ahead of her time. And he said, and besides, it would take a lot of money, and I don't have that kind of money. She said, if you agree to lead the hospital, I will build it. She built the hospital, St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester, which was the first part of the development of the Mayo Clinic. So St. Mary's Hospital still stands in Rochester, but it's been absorbed now into the Mayo Clinic. And what is very, very interesting is when people go back into the history of the Mayo Clinic, there is, you know, a very particular culture there. And part of that culture is the doctors are on salary. They don't get rich by treating more patients or a certain kind of patient. They work all the same to do whatever is their job for perfect health care at Mayo. And people have often reflected on the culture of Mayo being different for all of its great reputation. And people go back and say, well, there was something at the very beginning where the influence of the sisters about caring for the poor, about equality, about service. And of course, Dr. Mayo himself had much of those same qualities, is sort of baked into the place. So the rest is history, as they say. You know, today, if you say the Mayo Clinic, it's like, you know, it doesn't get any better, although the Cleveland Clinic, you know, would be in that realm as well. But I want to say to you that over the last 30 years, the Sisters of St. Francis in Rochester have challenged the leaders of the Mayo Clinic to go back and recover their Franciscan origins of service, of compassion. And they have literally taken hundreds of doctors and administrators from the Mayo Clinics on pilgrimage to Assisi to reflect on that. And finally, they put up a statue of Mother Alfred in front of the clinic next to the statue of the doctor, which of course had been there all along. But people finally realized this woman was just as responsible as he was for the beginning. So I'm just going to stop there and see if you have any comments, but I love it that she came here to get her Franciscan start. Any questions or thoughts or comments?
Does the Mayo Clinics have the same philosophy now?
They, as far as I know, they do. And actually, Athena, I'm going to go there to work with the sisters in late May. And that's going to be my chance to kind of get reacquainted with how things are going there. But they have a very strong mission sense. And usually a sister is part of their mission office, you know, working with their doctors, their administrators. And they have a wonderful, wonderful interfaith chapel right on the ground floor when you come into the Mayo Clinic, a real respect for all the different faiths. And of course, we know, I mean, there are, you know, Arab royalty who own the hotels in Rochester so that they can come all the time for their medical checkups.
Yeah.
So.
Well, if you get to Assisi Heights, make sure you see Patricia Schlosser and Mary Kay Flanagan,
Oh,
our
okay.
Chicago friends who are living there.
Well, listen, I will be there, so you need to give me something to take to them. I'll give
right.
you the dates when I'm going to be there. That'll be fun. That'll be fun. Yeah. So, and I should say to you too that
was
Pompo-
her,
yeah. I'm sorry.
what was her name? Mother what?
Actually, her given name was Maria, but she took the name Alfred. So she's known as Mother Alfred Mose. And her own sister stayed with her all through the year, so they're often photographed together. But she was one of those women. I think you would think twice before you crossed her. and I suspect, if you think about it, she was in 3 different communities through her career, so she probably would reach a point where, you know, better move on. So, okay, 2 more. The next one is also last century. And this woman is also New York, but not Western New York, Central New York. And her name is Mary Ann Cope. And since she was recently canonized, you may be a little bit familiar with her, but here again, I think the depth of what she achieved is something very few people recognize. So this woman came at the age of 3 from Germany with her family, and they immigrated to Utica, New York, where her father was a factory worker, and he was sick or injured on the job. And so through her teen years, she worked in a factory to support her family and then nursed her father for years up to the point of his death. And he died when she was in her early 20s. And as soon as those responsibilities were over, she joined a newly forming group of Franciscan sisters in Syracuse, New York. And very similar to what we saw with Mother Teresa O'Neill or Mother Alfred, she was very quickly given big responsibilities. She was a school administrator and teacher first, but within a couple of years, she was elected to the leadership council of the congregation. And then the sisters were being asked to provide some level of health care. So she founded St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Utica, New York. But the achievement that I think was especially important was she is the woman who founded St. Joseph's in Syracuse, which still today is one of the principal healthcare institutions in Syracuse. But I want to tell you a little bit about the kind of administrator she was. The people in Syracuse did not want Catholic nuns running a public institution in their town. They were very prejudiced against the church. And they also believed that somehow the city would end up having to assume debts or being sued, or there would be problems. So she went before the city council and she promised them that if they provided some initial financial support, she would never come back to the city for any help. So they reluctantly said yes. The hospital was built. And in those days, if you went to the hospital, you went to the hospital to die. So part of the fear of the Protestants of Syracuse was that these Catholic nuns were going to take these Protestants and baptize them Catholic on their deathbed, and, claim victory for the church. So they were having none of it. But here's what happened. People got better. And in fact, the level of excellence of care in that hospital was so astonishing that it really turned around the attitudes of the people. Why did they get better? She instituted basic hygienic practices that were not in existence in American healthcare. Doctors would go in and perform an autopsy and without washing their hands, go into a surgery suite. And she instituted, I think she's the patroness of the pandemic, hand washing, that people wash their hands, that they sanitize places, that there was a level of cleanliness about everything in the place. And so she reduced the number of deaths simply by introducing these practices, which were not common in the United States at the time. She convinced the Hospital of Surgeons, which at that time was in Geneva, to relocate to Syracuse, and she gave visiting privileges to the medical students, but she also wrote a Bill of Rights for the patients. So a patient could refuse. Some really young doctor came in and they thought, I don't want to be examined. They did not have to accept that. They accepted people of all faiths and religions into the hospital. And she and the sisters created a wonderful set of fundraising activities to keep raising money for the hospital. I love reading about the fact that if they had a big Christmas bazaar, which is very German, and the raffle prizes were a load of coal or a barrel of flour. That's what you won, if you got the winning lottery ticket at the Sisters Bazaar. Now, she was then elected the general of the hospital, of the sisters. And around the time she was elected, a letter came begging for sisters to go to Hawaii to care for people with Hansen's disease, leprosy. 40 communities in this country got that letter. She decided to say yes. So she asked sisters to volunteer. 35 volunteered to go. 6 were selected, and she went with them. And the assumption was she would get the sisters started and come back. She never came back. When she got to Hawaii, the authorities there, it was not a state, it was a kingdom. But the authorities there convinced her to build a hospital on Oahu and a hospital on Maui. And after 5 years, she said, enough. I came here to help Father Damien. I'm now going to Molokai. And when she got to Molokai, he already had leprosy and he only lived for 1 more year. She spent the rest of her life there taking care of all of the patients, in particular the women. And without going into a lot of detail, I will just say this. We have a journal written by a sister who lived with her for 4 decades. And it is very clear that one of the principal things she did was she protected the women on Molokai from sexual exploitation. It was very common because these were cast-offs. And the people sent to oversee, the care of the lepers these were not missionaries. These were government time servers, probably, people of very poor character and training themselves. And it was like a hellhole when the sisters got there. And we have eyewitness accounts. And my favorite is one night the emergency fire bell rang. The sisters were already in their night dress, but she said, it sounds like a terrible emergency, sisters, we better dress and go. And they go to the warden's office, and there is a woman, and he said, this woman was caught in adultery and she is to be punished, and we will punish her. And I want you sisters to see this and warn all of the women. He just went on and on and on. And when he was finished, Mother Mary Ann looked at him and said, and where is the man? And of course, the man had gone away and nobody had attempted to apprehend him. And there are multiple stories like that. And I won't say that she had a 21st century sensibility about these things, but she clearly intervened more than once for the protection of these women. So in some ways, I think she is a model on a lot of levels of a woman ahead of her time. So I'm just going to stop there and see if you have any questions or comments. She was canonized just about a decade ago. And for a long time, her remains were in Syracuse because the place where she was buried is going to be turned into a national park and memorial. But her remains have now been returned to Hawaii, where they'll be honored in the cathedral there in Honolulu, along with Father Damien. So any questions about her? Kristen?
I do have a question, and not just about her, but it seems like Franciscan women and healthcare go together. Is that, are women attracted to the Franciscan way because of its opportunities to be involved with healthcare in that way, or how does that happen?
I think it's because that is always a need. You know, anywhere you go, in any age, in any place, healthcare for the poor, healthcare for the marginal, you know, it's not profitable.
Right.
So who will take that on but people who can do it because they live an alternative economy, which is, you know, what sisters do. And I would say, certainly, I mean, there are other congregations of sisters totally focused on healthcare, but from the very beginning, and as Jean-Francois can comment on this, St. Clair herself was involved in the care of the sick. Jean-Francois, do you want to add to that idea?
Yeah, this is something so, for me, so important. Claire was recognized from the documents. She was recognized as a healer, but to be recognized as a healer in those times, and that goes actually until maybe 200 years ago, that means a woman with the knowledge and the skills of a physician. But physician, doctor, would never be given to a woman until relatively recently. And the whole life of Claire with her sisters were about taking care, addressing, as I would say, medical needs with a shelter, a hospice that they had next to their community. You know, people always talk of the monastery, but they never talk of the shelter, the hospice that was next to it, and actually was existing before Claire and her sisters. And the thing is, the whole Franciscan endeavor, the whole Franciscan movement, the whole Franciscan family started with responding, addressing to healthcare needs. And leprosy was a horrible thing at the time because they didn't know what it was. And the result was people were ostracized. They were actually celebrated their funeral and walked away to a colony, a concentration camp. So, Kristen, you're absolutely right. And I think more and more that it is important to say how Franciscan women, but at the beginning, Franciscan men also were involved in healthcare.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Kristen, there are some congregations where that is the only work they do. Many congregations, it's a combination, healthcare, teaching. And there are certainly other religious congregations like the Sisters of Mercy with a very high profile around healthcare. So yeah, it's kind of in the DNA, kind of in the DNA. So I have one last person, and now we're leaving far from America, but because her story is so little known, and I think she deserves to be more famous, I want to share a little bit about a modern martyr, Franciscan sister from India. And her name is Sister Rani, R-A-N-I, Maria. And this woman became a member of a Franciscan congregation called Franciscan Clarists in India in the early 1970s. Many sisters of this congregation have come here to St. Bonaventure to study, and Jean-Francois and I have had the pleasure of teaching them and getting to know them. Ronnie, when she came into the community, demonstrated a really strong desire to be with the poor. In India, if you think of a map of India, the poor are in the north. That's considered the mission territory of that country. So when these sisters would be sent to the north, it'd be for us like going to a third world country. We think of India as third world, but you talk to a sister from India, to go to the north is like you're really in tough territory. That's where Ronnie Marie went to. She was very well educated for the work she was doing. She had a degree in social work. And for 19 years, she lived in this region, going from village to village, helping the people. But here's what she was doing. She organized credit unions. She developed microloans. You know, everybody knows about the Grameen Bank, you know, where you go in and for a small loan, a person can start a farm or buy a cow or, you know, repair a truck or something like that. She started credit unions and small loans because she wanted the people to become self-sufficient and to learn how to manage with money that they would be responsible for. She had all sorts of developmental programs for the people that she was working among, and also teaching the women cottage industries where they could either make handiwork or through food sales or so on, earn some income for themselves. But what happened is, because she wasn't simply handing out charitable donations to the poor, but getting the poor to recognize she was getting into the way of a whole series of money lenders that profited from the poverty of these people. So these money lenders or loan sharks in this region would lend money at exorbitant rates and keep the people under their thumbs. It was a kind of a mafia, you know, where the people had to, you know, keep paying back in order not to be brutalized or killed. She was effectively creating a counterculture economy that the people would be able to manage themselves and not be at the beck and call of these money lenders. She was elected to the leadership council of the community, and she was needing to travel from the north to the south for a meeting with the congregation. So the day of her travel came, was February 25th, 1995, not so long ago. And there was a kind of a strange thing where the bus that was supposed to come didn't come, and then another bus arrived and she boarded the bus. And before that day's trip was over, the bus was stopped in a deserted place by a group of armed men who dragged her off the bus and stabbed her to death. So it was clearly a plan to assassinate her. She was stabbed 50 times. When the word went around that she had been martyred, we might say, 10,000 people came to her funeral. 10,000 people. Now, I find it very interesting that we all know about Mother Teresa. Why don't we know about Ronnie? She's a different model. She was a threat to economic injustice. And it's not, and I'm taking nothing away from Mother Teresa, she deserves the honor she has. But I think it's very interesting that here is a woman who used modern means and education and economic process to enable the poor to become independent. And it's kind of, oh, well, it's interesting. So I sort of, when I get a chance, I try to tell her story because I think she's the kind of person that deserves to be held up. And the last thing I want to say before we close off, thank you all, that the other wonderful Franciscan woman that I would like to pay tribute tonight to is to Athena. Athena, I know, I didn't let you know this ahead of time. Athena began her Franciscan life with a group of sisters in Chicago, and a time came when she felt a different call, and she and Jean-Francois decided that they would live a Franciscan life as husband and wife. And Athena has continued to live as a Franciscan woman without ever missing a beat, by moving from one form of Franciscan witness to another. And look at what she has done in our community. And the community she was in before she came here in Ohio. Healthcare policy, healthcare practice, practical on the ground assistance to people like Veggie Wheels, being a person who tries to bring the community together for its own well-being. So I just want to point that out because too often the notion of the Franciscan woman is over-identified with the sisters. And we sisters have so many sisters who are married or single and doing absolutely incredible work in their families and their workplace. And it's really important for all of us Franciscan women to link hands and stay tight together because it's a big world and there's a lot of Franciscan work to do. So on that score, I'm just going to say thank you. And I want to just give you a minute to see if there are any final remarks. I could have made that longer, Athena, so be grateful. I didn't go on and on and on.
Embarrassed to death, but thank you.
Back when you were asking if
Thank you, Sister Margaret.
from the mother house, I almost chimed in. I knew, oh, I'm blocking out her name, Sister Barb. But when I met her, she was a volunteer at the food pantry, and she never said anything about herself that would relate to her being from the mother house or a sister. She was just another volunteer amongst volunteers, just, humbly working to help people in need. And that she's the only person that I had met that I know of. I mean, there may be sisters in the community who are as stealthy as she is about who they are, just doing the work. So yeah, thank you for that, though. This was a really interesting, overview.
Thanks. Maybe when we can gather again, we could see if the sisters would let us do an evening there to meet some of the sisters, because there's some pretty remarkable women there.
Yeah.
Retired, but also still active,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you are. Few women who've touched our lives in the past and in the present. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Margaret.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Good night.
It was a wonderful time.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
presentation.
Okay.
Really.
You're welcome, my friend.
Thank you very much, Sister
See you
Margaret.
another time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good
That was
job,
wonderful. Thank you.
Athena. I don't know why my picture keeps leaving.